tiny house, 3 bedrooms, 9 kids, 1 bathroom. A father who worked at a steel mill during the day and chased a dream for his family at night. The kind of neighborhood where nobody expected anything extraordinary to happen, where life was routine, the winters were cold, and your options felt limited by your zip code. Now picture this. 70,000 people standing in a stadium in another country, screaming a name so loud the ground actually shakes. One person walking out onto a stage, and the entire crowd, every single one of them, losing their minds before he even opens his mouth. Just from the silhouette, just from the walk. Those 2 images, that tiny house and that stadium, they are connected by one of the most extraordinary journeys in the history of human entertainment. And today we are going inside that journey. Not just the highlights you already know. Not just the moonwalk, the glove, the thriller video. We're going deeper. We're talking about the pressure no child should carry, the breakthroughs nobody saw coming, the moments where everything could have collapsed, and the almost supernatural force that kept pushing Michael Jackson forward. Because here's the thing about Michael Jackson's story that most people miss. It's not just a story about talent. Plenty of talented people never make it out of their hometown. It's a story about what happens when raw, God-given ability collides with relentless pressure, impossible expectations, and an unbreakable will to create something that lasts. And that story starts in a place nobody expected it to. Before we go further, if you've ever wondered how one person could genuinely change the entire direction of music, dance, and pop culture at the same time, stick around. This is the full picture. And if you enjoy this kind of deep dive storytelling, go ahead and subscribe right now. We do this every week and you do not want to miss what's coming next. Okay, let's get into it. Gary, Indiana in 1958 was not a place people were writing songs about, at least not yet. It was a working-class steel town on the southern tip of Lake Michigan. Factories dominated the skyline. The air smelled like industry. Most families worked hard, lived simply, and hoped their kids would have a slightly easier go of it than they did. Joseph Walter Jackson, Joe Jackson, was one of those people. He worked at U.S. Steel and he had a family that was growing fast. He and his wife Catherine had 9 children together. Rebby, Jackie, Tito, German, Latoya, Marlon, Michael, Randy, and Janet. 9 kids, all living in a house that measured less than 1,000 square feet. Let that sink in for a second. Less than 1,000 square feet for 11 people. Michael Joseph Jackson was born on August 29, 1958. He was the 7th child, and by all accounts, from the very beginning, there was something different about him. Now people love to romanticize that kind of thing in hindsight. Oh, everyone could tell from day when he was special. And sure, sometimes that's just nostalgia talking. But in Michael's case, the people who were actually there, his siblings, his mother, early neighbors, all described the same thing. When Michael started to move, something happened in the room. When he started to sing, even as a toddler, people stopped what they were doing. Catherine Jackson later recalled that Michael could hear a song on the radio once and sing it back near perfectly. Not just the melody, the feeling, the phrasing, the soul of it, at 3 and 4 years old. Joe Jackson noticed too. And here's where the story gets complicated because Joe Jackson is a figure you genuinely cannot talk about Michael's childhood without addressing, and honestly. Joe was, by every account, a man of enormous contradictions. He was driven. He was disciplined. He genuinely believed his children were gifted. But his methods, brutal, demanding in ways that left deep marks. Joe had his own musical dreams that never quite came true. He'd been in a band called the Falcons before the responsibilities of a large family took over. So when he saw his kids had talent, he channeled everything into them. And everything meant rehearsals that lasted for hours. Rehearsals that didn't stop because you were tired. Rehearsals where mistakes had consequences that went beyond a stern word. Michael later described growing up in fear of his father. Not just in interviews where you might expect some dramatization, but in his own written words, in his autobiography Moonwalk, and in quiet, painful conversations that friends and colleagues described over the years. He talked about how a look from his father could make his stomach drop. How the rehearsals were both the thing that made him great and the thing that stole something from him he could never get back. But here's the tension that's important to understand. Michael was also obsessed with music and performance in a way that existed completely independent of his father's pressure. Even when Joe wasn't watching, Michael was studying. He would watch James Brown on television and practice the footwork in the living room for hours. He would listen to Jackie Wilson records and try to understand why certain phrases landed the way they did. The drive was real. The love for it was genuine. It just existed alongside a childhood that wasn't easy. By 1962, Joe had organized his sons into a performing group. Jackie, Tito, German, Marlon, and Michael, the five brothers who would eventually become known to the world as the Jackson Five. They started performing locally, talent shows, community events, small clubs. And Michael, who was only about 6 years old at the time, was already the one people couldn't take their eyes off. There's a famous story from one of their early talent show appearances. The crowd was polite for the older brothers. They clapped, they nodded. And then Michael stepped forward, and the audience, who had seen this kid walk and looking like any other child, suddenly sat up straighter. Something about the way he moved, the way he inhabited the music, made it impossible to look anywhere else. He won the talent show. He was maybe 6. By the mid-1960s, the Jackson Five were performing regularly in the Midwest. They played the Chitlin Circuit, a network of venues across America that were safe and welcoming for black performers during the era of segregation and racial tension. These weren't glamorous gigs. The travel was hard. The accommodations were modest. The money was inconsistent. But the experience, invaluable. By the time Michael Jackson was 10 years old, he had already logged more stage hours than most professional musicians accumulate in a decade. He had learned how to read a crowd, how to bring energy up and pull it back, how to make a massive room feel like you were singing directly to one person. And he was still in elementary school. By 1968, the Jackson Five had developed a reputation in the Midwest. Word was spreading. They weren't just a novelty act, a cute group of kids performing adult songs. They were genuinely good, competitive, professional in a way that made audiences do a double take. Several things happened around this time that changed the trajectory of everything. First, they got a significant break performing at the Apollo Theater in New York City. The Apollo was, and still is, one of the most legendary music venues in the world. Its amateur night was notorious for brutally honest crowds. If they didn't like you, they would tell you, loudly, without hesitation. The Jackson Five walked out, and the crowd went wild. For Michael specifically, performing at the Apollo was like a revelation. He later described feeling completely at home on that stage in a way that he never quite felt anywhere else in his life at that point. The energy between performer and audience, the give and take, the moment when a crowd stops being individuals and becomes one living, breathing thing responding to what you're doing. He understood that intuitively in ways that most performers spend their entire careers chasing. The Apollo performance caught attention, and soon the group found their way to Motown Records in Detroit. Now, Motown in the late 1960s was arguably the most important label in American music. Berry Gordy had built something extraordinary, a machine that produced hit after hit, that developed artists not just musically, but in terms of presentation, choreography, interview skills, everything. Motown didn't just make music. Motown manufactured stardom with a level of intentionality that the industry hadn't seen before. And Berry Gordy, when he saw the Jackson Five, immediately understood what he had. The label signed them in 1969. They moved the family, Joe and the performing brothers, out to California, and within months they were recording. Their debut single dropped in October of 1969, I Want You Back. If you have never heard that song, stop this video right now and go listen to it. I'm serious, come back after. Because the way that song opens, that piano riff, is one of the most instantly recognizable sounds in the history of recorded music. And then the vocals come in. And the voice you hear first, the voice that carries the song, belongs to an 11-year-old boy. 11's I Want You Back hit #1, not after building slowly, not after months of airplay. It shot to the top almost immediately. The follow-up, ABC, hit #1. The Love You Save, #1. I'll Be There, #1. 4 consecutive #1 singles from their first 4 releases. That had never happened before with a new group. Not like that, not that fast. And Michael was the face of all of it. He was doing interviews. He was on magazine covers. He was appearing on variety shows and talk shows where hosts would ask him questions as though speaking to an adult, and he would answer with this combination of earnestness and charm that made everyone, regardless of age, fall a little bit in love with him. But here's something that often gets glossed over in the Jackson Five rise to fame narrative. Behind all the #1s and the TV appearances and the tour, Michael was still a kid navigating something genuinely difficult. He wasn't going to school in any regular sense. His social world was almost entirely adults, producers, label executives, journalists, performers. His concept of normal childhood experiences was being formed by what he saw through tour bus windows and hotel room televisions. He later described watching other kids play outside from those windows and feeling something he struggled to name. Not quite jealousy, more like confusion. A growing awareness that his life and what he was being told was normal were very different things. Meanwhile, Motown was packaging the Jackson 5 in a very specific way: bright colors, big smiles, age-appropriate love songs delivered with enormous energy and charm. It worked commercially, spectacularly. But it also meant Michael was being shaped by the label's vision of what he should be, often in tension with who he was actually becoming. By the early 1970s, Michael had also begun releasing solo material alongside the group's work. His early solo Motown albums, Got to Be There and Ben, showed a different side of his artistry, quieter, more emotionally nuanced. Ben, a ballad about a rat, yes, really, it was a movie tie-in, but Stay With Me, went to #1 and showed that Michael could deliver something genuinely moving and tender, not just high-energy spectacle. He was 14 years old. Here's a tension that existed throughout Michael Jackson's teenage years that doesn't get talked about enough. He was famous, internationally famous. The kind of famous where crowds of people genuinely screaming at the sight of him famous. And he was also a teenager who was, by his own later admission, deeply unhappy in several key ways. The relationship with his father remained difficult. Joe Jackson was their manager for much of this period, which meant the person who held authority over Michael's creative and professional life was also the person who had made him afraid as a small child. That is a psychologically complex situation for any young person, and Michael was navigating it entirely in public, without the safety net of a private life. There were also issues around his appearance that began to surface during his teenage years. He developed acne, as teenagers do, but the scrutiny Michael faced was not what most teenagers face. He was a public figure. Photographs appeared in magazines. Comments were made. And there are accounts, including from Michael himself, that Joe Jackson made cutting remarks about Michael's nose and appearance during this period. For a kid who was already sensitive, already processing a childhood full of pressure and criticism, that cut deep. And here is where you begin to understand why Michael Jackson's later life would become so complicated in ways the public often reduced to mockery or sensationalism. The roots of his relationship with his own image, something that would define and haunt him for decades, were planted in this period. But creatively, something was also starting to emerge that was genuinely exciting. Michael was consuming music and performance at an astonishing rate. He studied Fred Astaire. He studied Charlie Chaplin. He was fascinated by the physicality of performance, the idea that a body in motion could communicate things that words and melody alone couldn't. He practiced constantly, not because Joe was forcing him to at this point, but because he was chasing something he could feel but hadn't yet fully expressed. In 1975, the Jackson family made a major business decision. They left Motown and signed with Epic Records, a division of CBS. This was a genuinely bold move. Motown had made them stars. Leaving felt like a risk. And initially it was. The first few years on Epic didn't produce the massive commercial success of their Motown period. But it set the stage for everything. Because at Epic, Michael would eventually encounter a producer named Quincy Jones. And that partnership would change popular music permanently. Before that happened, though, Michael spent a few years working with his brothers, touring, recording, and quietly developing his own artistic vision in ways that weren't yet fully visible to the public. He also landed a film role during this period that he cherished deeply, the role of the Scarecrow in The Wiz, a 1978 all-black reimagining of The Wizard of Oz. The film itself received mixed reviews, but Michael's experience making it was transformative for two reasons. First, he threw himself into the acting with the same obsessive preparation he brought to music. He researched the character. He thought deeply about how the Scarecrow would move, given that he was supposedly without a brain. And Michael, with his extraordinary physical intelligence, created a genuinely distinctive and affecting physicality for the role. Second, and this is the part that changed everything, the musical director of The Wiz was Quincy Jones. And Quincy Jones, watching Michael work on that film, took note. 1979. Michael Jackson is 20 years old, and he is about to make his first fully realized artistic statement. Off the Wall was produced by Quincy Jones and recorded at various studios in Los Angeles. And the collaboration between Jones and Jackson was, from the very beginning, something rare. Quincy brought production sophistication, musical depth, industry experience, and, crucially, a willingness to follow Michael's instincts even when they were unconventional. Because Michael had instincts that were genuinely unconventional, he would hear a musical passage and say, "The bass needs to go somewhere else here. Something is missing right there." And Quincy would sit with it and often realize that Michael, who couldn't necessarily articulate his intuition in formal musical terms, was absolutely right. There are stories from the off-the-wall sessions of Michael singing guide vocals for every single instrument in the track. Not because he was being difficult or controlling, but because he could hear the whole picture in his head, and the fastest way to communicate it to the musicians was to sing it. He would do the bass line, then the string arrangement, then the horn hits, all of it in his voice so the players understood what was supposed to happen. The result was an album that sounded unlike anything else in 1979. It wasn't quite funk. It wasn't quite soul. It wasn't quite pop. It was all of those things at once, filtered through a sensibility that was entirely Michael's own. Don't stop till you get enough. Rock with you, Off the Wall, She's Out of My Life. Off the Wall sold over 20 million copies. It produced 4 top 10 singles from one album, another record-breaking achievement. Critics celebrated it. Fellow musicians celebrated it. And Michael Jackson was nominated for 1 Grammy Award. Won. He lost. And that moment of institutional underestimation planted a seed of something fierce in Michael Jackson. He was proud of Off the Wall. He believed it deserved more recognition, and he made a private promise to himself that the next album would make the industry impossible to ignore. That promise became Thriller. Let's talk about Thriller properly, because the numbers get thrown around so often that they start to lose their meaning, and I want you to actually feel what this album represented. When Thriller was released in November of 1982, it opened to immediate commercial success. That was somewhat expected given the groundwork Off the Wall had laid. What nobody expected, was what happened over the following 18 months. The album didn't just sell well. It refused to stop. Week after week, it stayed at the top of the charts, month after month. In the United States, in the United Kingdom, in Japan, in Australia, in Brazil, in Germany. It was as if the entire world had collectively decided that this was the thing to listen to, and they were going to keep listening to it indefinitely. 7 of the album's 9 tracks were released as singles. 7. Each one of them charted. Each one of them became its own cultural event. Billie Jean gave us one of the most hypnotic bass lines in the history of recorded music, and a story so tight and compelling that people still debate the specifics of its narrative today. Beat It brought Eddie Van Halen's electric guitar into a pop-soul context in a way nobody had heard before, and in doing so, obliterated the invisible wall between rock and R&B radio. Wanna Be Startin' Something opened the album with a surge of energy that suggested, correctly, that what followed was going to be relentless. And then there was Thriller itself, 14 minutes, a spoken introduction from Vincent Price, the master of horror himself, a full narrative arc, a music video that cost more than any music video ever made at that point, directed by John Landis, with makeup and transformation effects by Rick Baker, and choreography that Michael and his team created, and that became probably the single most imitated sequence of dance moves in history. The Thriller video was not just a music video, it was a short film, and when it premiered on MTV in December of 1983, the channel aired it multiple times in a row because the demand was so high. People called in. They arranged their evenings around it. They gathered with friends to watch it the way earlier generations had gathered to watch the moon landing. Now here's something that doesn't get enough attention about this era. Michael Jackson's crossover onto MTV was not automatic. MTV in the early 1980s had an unstated but very real policy of not playing music by black artists. Their programming was almost entirely rock and pop performed by white artists. When Epic Records submitted Billie Jean for airplay, there was resistance. CBS Records president Walter Yetnikoff reportedly threatened to pull all CBS artists from the network entirely if Billie Jean wasn't added to rotation. It was added, and once it was on MTV, the landscape of the network, and of the music industry broadly, began to shift. Michael Jackson didn't just break that barrier. He shattered it in a way that opened doors for black artists in mainstream media that had been firmly shut before. At the 1984 Grammy Awards, Thriller won 8 Grammy Awards in a single night. 8. It remains one of the most decorated albums in Grammy history. Michael showed up in his military jacket, his single glove, his sunglasses with his good friend Brooke Shields on his arm, and the image was beamed around the world. He was 25 years old. The album would go on to sell somewhere between 66 and 70 million copies. The precise figure is debated because it's sold continuously since 1982. The Guinness World Records lists it as the best-selling album of all time. But the Moonwalk, we have to talk about the Moonwalk. The move itself was not invented by Michael Jackson. Variations of the backward glide had been used by other performers, tap dancers, James Brown, Jeffrey Daniel of Shalamar. Michael had studied these earlier versions. But what he did on May 16, 1983, performing Billie Jean on the Motown 25, Yesterday, Today, and Forever television special, that was different. It wasn't just the technique, it was the context, the way he set it up, the way he was dancing normally and then almost casually he slid backward as if gravity had simply stopped applying to him, the way it looked effortless while being mechanically extraordinary. The crowd in the auditorium screamed as if something impossible had happened in front of them, because visually it kind of had. Fred Astaire called Michael the next day to tell him it was the greatest performance he had ever seen. Astaire, who was in his 80s, had spent his entire life watching and making extraordinary dance performance, and he picked up the phone. After Thriller, the obvious question was, what do you do next? The honest answer is, you can't top it. Nobody could. It was an unrepeatable event, a perfect alignment of artistic achievement, cultural timing, and global hunger for something that felt new. Even Michael Jackson himself couldn't top Thriller, and he knew it. What he could do, what he chose to do, was something different, darker, more mature, more assertive. Bad was released in August of 1987. And before we talk about the album itself, let's talk about the context in which it arrived, because it matters. By 1987, Michael Jackson was no longer just a musician. He was a phenomenon, a globally recognized figure in a way that very few people in human history had been. His face was known everywhere. His voice was recognized everywhere. He was, in a real sense, one of the most famous individual human beings alive. And fame at that scale is not a comfortable thing. It changes your life in fundamental ways that are hard to overstate. The logistics of his existence had become genuinely extraordinary. He couldn't walk through a public space, couldn't go to a store, couldn't take a walk. Security, planning, management, every movement and operation. In that context, Bad was Michael pushing back. The opening track, Bad, was aggressive, confrontational, a Michael Jackson nobody quite expected. The leather, the buckles, the visual swagger of the era. He was staking a claim to a harder-edged identity, partly in response to a music press that had already started packaging him as something soft, something safe. Musically, Bad produced 5 consecutive #1 singles, a record that still stands. I Just Can't Stop Loving You, Bad, The Way You Make Me Feel, Man in the Mirror, Dirty Diana. 5 songs from the same album, all going to #1. It's never been matched. The Bad World Tour that followed ran from September 1987 through January 1989. It covered 123 concerts across 15 countries. Total attendance, approximately 4.4 million people. At the time, it was the largest grossing tour in history. Michael performed to 500,000 people in a single series of concerts in West Germany alone. He gave everything at every show. There were nights where he was genuinely ill and performed anyway. There were nights where the physical demands of what he was doing, the dancing, the staging, the sheer commitment to the performance, left him physically spent in ways the audience never saw because he refused to let it show. The tour also gave the world some of the most documented evidence of what Michael Jackson at his peak could do to a crowd. There's footage from multiple cities, Rome, Tokyo, Leeds, Los Angeles, of crowds that had been waiting for hours, sometimes days, losing complete composure the moment he stepped on stage. People fainting, people weeping, not from sadness, from an overwhelming emotional response that most of them couldn't explain afterward. He called it stage-fright in reverse. He was scared before going on. The moment he stepped out, he said the fear left and something else took over, something he couldn't explain. The 1990s were when the story of Michael Jackson became genuinely complicated for the public to follow. And it's worth being honest about that complexity rather than simplifying it in either direction. His artistry continued. Dangerous, released in 1991, showcased Michael working with new producer Teddy Riley, pushing the sound into the emerging new jack swing territory while still maintaining the pop grandeur that was his signature. Black or White opened with a hard rock guitar riff from Slash of Guns N' Roses. This was Michael continuing to refuse genre limitations. The song debuted at #1 in the United States, the first song to do that since the Beatles in 1964. The short film for Black or White ended with a solo sequence of Michael dancing that was so raw and physically intense it sparked controversy, and was eventually edited for later broadcasts. It was Michael expressing something visceral, something angry, something that didn't fit the polished image people expected. It was real, it was complicated, and it reminded anyone watching that there was a human being inside all the spectacle who had things he needed to say. H.I. Story, released in 1995, was Michael's most explicitly personal work. A double album, one disc of greatest hits, one disc of new material, it felt like a statement. Songs like Scream, recorded with his sister Janet, They Don't Care About Us. An Earth song addressed race, injustice, media treatment, and global suffering in ways that were pointed and sometimes raw. The H.I. Story World Tour in 1996 and 1997 again set records. Again, millions of people. But during this entire period, Michael's personal life and public image were under siege in ways that are genuinely difficult to describe in proportion without getting into detail that warrants its own documentary. Allegations, legal battles, media coverage that was, by any reasonable measure, relentless and often unbalanced. He was tried in the court of public opinion before any court of law had reached any conclusion. He maintained his innocence. The legal proceedings resulted in settlements or acquittals. The truth of what happened, what didn't happen, and what Michael Jackson experienced during those years is something reasonable, informed people still discuss and disagree about. What is not really up for debate is the effect on him personally. He became more withdrawn, more guarded. He spent increasing amounts of time at Neverland Ranch, his extraordinary property in Santa Barbara County, which he had designed as a kind of personal paradise, part amusement park, part zoo, part sanctuary. His appearance changed significantly during this period. Skin lightening that he attributed to the skin condition vitiligo, which is real and well documented. He was later confirmed posthumously to have the condition. Multiple surgeries, which he sometimes acknowledged and sometimes was evasive about. The person who looked back from magazine covers in 1997 bore less and less visual resemblance to the child from Gary, Indiana. The media's treatment of these changes was often cruel. It reduced a complex human experience, the interplay of personal trauma, medical condition, psychological response to fame, and genuine creative self-expression, to punchlines. And those punchlines obscured the person. Through it all, his music remained. His influence on other artists remained. Walk through any era of popular music from the 1990s onward, and you will find Michael Jackson's fingerprints everywhere. In the production choices, the choreography, the theatrical ambition of music videos, the standard of live performance. Artists from Beyoncé to Usher to Justin Timberlake to Bruno Mars have spoken openly about how central Michael was to their development. Because talent recognizes talent, and whatever the tabloids were saying, working musicians knew exactly what they were dealing with. By the mid-2000s, Michael Jackson had become something the English language doesn't have a perfect word for. He was simultaneously the biggest, most impactful pop star who had ever lived, and deeply misunderstood by a substantial portion of the public. The Invincible album in 2001 had been a commercial disappointment relative to his earlier work, though commercial disappointment for Michael Jackson still meant millions of albums sold. He clashed with his record label. There were disputes about promotion and support. The relationship soured. He moved internationally. He lived in Bahrain for a time, thanks to the hospitality of a member of the ruling family there. He was finding his footing, figuring out what came next, staying close to his 3 children, Michael Jr. Prince, Paris, and Blanket, whose full name is Prince Michael II. His children were his great joy during this period. By every account from people who saw him with them, he was a devoted and attentive father. He had created for his children the private, protected childhood that had never been available to him. They lived differently, sheltered from fame in ways that were sometimes extreme, yes, but born from a genuine desire to give them what he had never had. In 2009, the announcement came. Michael Jackson would return to the stage. 50 concerts at the O2 Arena in London. This is it. He had rehearsed the shows, worked with a production team, selected a band and dancers. The scale of what was being planned was enormous, a tour de force of everything Michael Jackson could do, presented with the production values of 2009 and the back catalog of a career spanning 4 decades. Tickets sold out within minutes. Millions of people tried to get tickets. It became one of the most discussed upcoming events in entertainment. People who had seen him perform in the 1980s were planning to come. People who had only known him through recordings were going to see, for the first time, what the legend actually looked and sounded like live. Rehearsals were filmed, both for production planning purposes and because everyone understood they were watching something historic. Footage later released as the documentary This Is It showed Michael in the weeks before his death, and what it showed was remarkable. He was engaged. He was creative. He was giving notes to his dancers, his musicians, his production team, with the same attention to detail that had defined his entire career. He looked thinner than in his peak years, but the voice was there, the instincts were there, the perfectionism was there. In one rehearsal sequence, he stops in the middle of a run-through of The Way You Make Me Feel and gently corrects a musician's timing. He's not angry. He's not dramatic. He's just precise. He knows exactly what he's hearing and exactly what it should be instead. It's a window into the private creative process of a genius, and it's humbling to watch. The shows were set to begin in July. On the morning of June 25, 2009, Michael Jackson's personal physician, Dr. Conrad Murray, called 911 from the rented mansion in Bel Air, Los Angeles, where Michael had been staying during rehearsals. Michael Jackson was 50 years old. He was taken to UCLA Medical Center. The world found out via news alerts, via Twitter, then still a relatively new platform, via phone calls between people who couldn't believe what they were reading. There was a period of agonizing uncertainty that lasted perhaps an hour, and then the confirmation came. He was gone. The cause of death was acute propofol and benzodiazepine intoxication. Dr. Conrad Murray, who had been administering propofol, an anesthetic typically only used in hospital surgical settings, as a sleep aid, was later convicted of involuntary manslaughter. The reaction to Michael Jackson's death was unlike anything the internet age had seen before. Twitter went down under the load of people trying to post about it simultaneously. Google's servers reportedly struggled with the search volume. The Los Angeles Memorial Service, held at the Staples Center, was broadcast live and watched by an estimated 31 million people in the United States alone, and hundreds of millions more globally. And then something interesting happened. Something that says a great deal about what Michael Jackson's music actually was and is. People went back to the music. In the weeks following his death, his albums dominated the charts in ways they hadn't in years. Thriller re-entered the Billboard 200, Off the Wall re-entered, Bad re-entered. People who hadn't listened to Michael Jackson in years or who had only dimly known his work went back to listen and discovered what had always been there. Here's the question that actually matters, beyond the records and the controversies and the tragedy of how it ended. What did Michael Jackson actually mean? Why does it matter? Here's what I think, and I think this is actually provable, not just sentimental. Michael Jackson demonstrated that popular music, the stuff on the radio, the stuff teenagers dance to, the stuff playing in the background of ordinary life, could also be art. Capital A art, not in spite of its accessibility, but through it. He showed that you could make something that 50 million people wanted to hear and something that stood up to serious artistic scrutiny. That those two things were not in opposition. That the goal of reaching as many people as possible and the goal of creating something genuinely meaningful and lasting were not mutually exclusive. He made music video into a legitimate art form. Before Michael Jackson, music videos were promotional tools, quick, cheap clips made to sell records. After Billie Jean, after Beat It, after Thriller, after Black or White, they were something else. They were events. They told stories. They required budgets and directors and choreographers and concepts. He elevated the form, and everyone who came after him operated in the world he made. He broke barriers in ways that had real, lasting effects on the industry and on culture. The MTV barrier was not a small thing. Black artists in mainstream American media owe a structural debt to the moment when Michael Jackson made it impossible for those doors to stay shut. He is the reason that music, dance, and spectacle became inseparable in mainstream pop performance. Every arena concert you see today, the staging, the choreography, the theatrical ambition, exists in a lineage that runs directly through Michael Jackson. He set the standard. Everyone else is trying to meet it. And his influence is genuinely global in a way that almost no other artist can claim. There are dancers in South Korea doing his moves, children in Nigeria who learned to sing from his records, teenagers in Brazil who discovered his music this year for the first time and fell completely in love with it. The music crosses language. It crosses culture. It communicates something that human beings respond to regardless of where they were born or what language they speak. That is extraordinarily rare, actually rare. Not most popular in his genre, rare, genuinely rare. From a tiny house in Gary, Indiana, 11 people, less than 1,000 square feet, to the most famous human being alive. From a child performing at talent shows in the Midwest to a man who could make stadiums full of people weep just by walking on stage. He paid a real price for that journey. The childhood that was given away, the privacy that was never possible, the relationships that couldn't quite reach him through the layers of fame, the traumas that manifested in complicated ways that the world mostly chose to caricature rather than understand. The loneliness of being, genuinely and literally, incomparable, of being someone with no one else's experience to reference because no one else had ever lived this particular life. He paid that price, and what he made with the life he had, the music, the art, the innovations, the standard he set, that is still here, still playing, still moving people. The king of pop, the greatest entertainer who ever lived, a child from Gary who somehow became universal. Michael Jackson didn't just make music that people liked. He made music that made people feel things they didn't know they could feel, things they couldn't always name, things that hit somewhere deeper than entertainment usually reaches. And that, not the records, not the Grammys, not the tour grosses, that is why we are still talking about him. That is why there will always be someone somewhere who is hearing Rock With You or Man in the Mirror or Human Nature for the first time, and stopping, and feeling something, and wanting to know more about the person who made it. The story doesn't end. It just keeps finding new people to tell itself. So that's the full picture. From Gary, Indiana to the global stage. From a 3-bedroom house with 11 people to the most famous human being on Earth. From a child who was pushed harder than any child should be, to an artist who pushed himself harder than anyone else could have. Michael Jackson's story is not a simple one. It was never simple. It was filled with joy and pain and genius and suffering and grace and confusion and an unbelievable, almost incomprehensible level of creative output. But the music is simple in the best sense of the word. It's immediate, it's human, it's joyful and heartbreaking and physical and spiritual all at once, and it will outlast all of us. Now I want to hear from you. What's the song, the performance, the memory that, for you, captures who Michael Jackson was? Was it hearing Thriller for the first time? The Moonwalk? Man in the Mirror coming on at a moment when you needed it? Drop it in the comments, let's talk about it. And if this video gave you something, a new perspective, a fact you didn't know, a reason to go put on off the wall tonight, do me a favor and share it with someone who loves music. That's how stories like this stay alive. Subscribe if you haven't already, hit the bell. There is a lot more where this came from. And until next time, keep listening to the music that makes you feel something.